One, showtime. Well, it's great having everybody here with us today. You are here in the Casa de la Place in McAllen, Texas. And it's, again, wonderful having you here. We are picking back up. We're going back to Luke. We decided to take a break and to wait on doing Luke until hopefully we are able to get back together and to continue this study together. But we honestly don't know when that will be. And one of the least favorite things I have to do is come up with new topics. Once I have a topic, I can go with it all about. So here we go. Last time we met, and again, as I was telling people earlier, I put the last class up on the Facebook wall earlier this week. If you're not keyed into the Facebook wall, or you just rather go to YouTube, you can go to YouTube and search up all the classes that we've had in this Luke class before. And today we're going to be in Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 24. Now, this actually drops us right into the middle of a section. And this section is a lot of action going on. We are in a time in which Jesus finished preaching the Sermon on the Plain, the smaller version of the Sermon on the Mount that Luke writes, that only takes the back part of chapter 6. So just because it's short, that still took a couple of weeks for us to get through, because it's filled with hard-hitting teachings. Now, here we are in chapter 7. Jesus is able to live some of this stuff out. He's healing people. He healed the centurion's servant, which also at the same time was a great example of faith, because this is Luke's account where the centurion says, I'm not worthy to have you in my house, but you say the word and my servant will be made well. And Jesus makes a statement, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. The servant is healed. This is also the chapter in which Jesus raises the widow's son. Again, where do widows rank back in the ancient world? Not very high, but Jesus takes time out in order to revive the widow's son. And then we get the disciples from John the Baptist, John being locked away in prison at this time. John sends the disciples with the question, are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? And we took a great amount of time in the last class in March, really diving into what that question was all about. But as Jesus finishes up with the disciples from John the Baptist, Jesus finishes with this thought out of verse 23, and blessed is the one who is not offended by me. It's a great, interesting statement, especially in this context, dealing with John the Baptist, because we have to ask, was John the Baptist offended at Jesus? I don't think so. But as we talked about back in March, I'll reiterate it here again, because I don't know about you, but I've slept since then. Instead of viewing it as blessed is the one who is not offended by me, consider this statement. Blessed is the one who does not misunderstand me. And that's kind of where John was. Again, John being locked away in prison, not being able to see the work of Jesus, and only getting information about the work of Jesus second or maybe third hand, because he can't get out. Also, I don't think it's accidental that we're supposed to reflect back on prophecies that deal with, I'm going to bring joy to the poor, but also freedom to the captives and all this. Hello, John's a captive, and he's still there, even though Jesus is around. So again, hey, are you the guy, or are you not a guy? And so Jesus answers the question in ways in which John the Baptist would understand, with the use of miracles, because Jesus takes a solid hour to heal the people. Oh, by the way, there's a question. Is this in the New Testament? Yes, it is. Sorry, I got ADD. Sometimes I got to cue in. Yes, we're going to be in Luke, and Luke is the third book of the New Testament. If you can find that break between the Old and New Testaments, then you're going to have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In case you're still having trouble, your Bible should have a table of contents in the front, and a lot of Bibles also have a list of the books of the Bible in alphabetical order. I guess for some people that is easier to find. But once you find Luke, and I'm glad you're here with us, Once you find Luke, we're going to be in chapter 7 and verse 24. So 3 ways in which Jesus answers John: a solid hour performing miracles, teaching the people about the kingdom of heaven, and also the fact of Jesus and also John the Baptist being people who fulfilled Old Testament prophecy. So all of this is part of this answer to John. And also in this chapter, this is where the great debate of Jesus' identity begins. You see this in the Gospels. People ask, well, who is the Christ? Who is the Son? Who is Jesus' parents? What is this Jesus? What is he? Is he a prophet? Is he the Messiah? Is he demon-possessed? What is he? And this is chapter 7 is where in Luke's account, we get this answer. Now, who and what is Jesus? He performs miracles and he raises the dead. Now, us on this side, being Gentiles like we are, we might say, well, obviously he's the Messiah. But again, remember, you go back to your Old Testaments, and according to Jewish history, a case may be made for either of those 2 choices, because we had prophets. Elijah raised some folk back in the day and also performed miracles, for example. So again, miracles, being raised from the dead and all this kind of stuff, that Jesus is not the only one who has ever done that. So if you're going to look for a separation between Jesus being the Messiah and Jesus being the prophet, you cannot just use Jesus doing miracles. There has to be more. And what is more is his teaching. So the people have to decide, how are they going to take Jesus? But also, it's true of us today. How are we going to take Jesus? Because Jesus is Jesus, and Jesus' teachings are Jesus' teachings. But that doesn't mean that we accept them. Where do we fall on this? So that's kind of a wrap up of where we were back in March, the last thing we talked about in March. And so now let's jump into verse 24. And we're starting here because 24 tells us, when John's messengers had gone. So Jesus gets done talking to the disciples of John the Baptist, and then Jesus turns back to the crowd and is going to start teaching the crowd about John the Baptist. Okay, check this out. This first section we're going to look at is Luke chapter 7, and we're going to be in verses 24. We're going to go through 29. It says, when John's messengers had gone, Jesus began to speak to the crowds concerning John. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Behold, those who are dressed in splendid clothing and live in luxury are in king's courts. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is he of whom it is written, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. I tell you, among those born of women, none is greater than John. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of God is greater than he. When all the people heard this, and the tax collectors too, they declared God just, having been baptized with the baptism of John. But the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected the purpose of God for themselves, not having been baptized by him. Okay, so let's go back and look at some things like this. For example, Jesus has this question, what did you go into the wilderness to see? This is a very interesting question because of the truth that it contains. John's center of operation was the Jordan River. Some people speculate that it was about 5 miles north before the mouth that opens up into the Dead Sea. Now, this location is several miles walk from Jerusalem, Galilee. 10, 20, miles, and more based on where you are in Israel. And yet people were willing to leave their homes and go out to John the Baptist to hear him speak and to be baptized by John. Now, again, look at the question that Jesus is asking them. What did you go into the wilderness to see? John wasn't like some other workers of the kingdom. John didn't work like Jesus. Jesus moved about from place to place. When Jesus would send out the 12 disciples and then later the 72 disciples, he sent them to all the towns of Israel to do work among there. But John worked along that Jordan River. And if you wanted to see John, you had to leave where you were and go out to where John was so that you could see John. And so the question then is searching for their motive. What did they go to the wilderness to see? What were they wanting to find John for? What were they hoping to find? When we go and search for the Lord, what are we hoping to find? And do we put the expectation on ourselves to go searching for God, or are we sitting back waiting for God to find us? But if we are the type of people who want to go searching for God, what are we looking for? If we're going looking for a church, what are we looking for? If we're looking for a preacher, what are we looking for? These people looking for John. Jesus asking them, you left your homes to go find this man. Why? What are you after? What do you want? And Jesus gives them a couple of nonsense or sarcastic, non-serious answers first, and then he hits them with the truth. The first non-serious answer is a reed shaken by the wind. Did you leave your home and go walking for at least 10 miles, say, so that you can go see a reed shaken by a wind? And we think, well, what does that mean? We know what that means. Did you go out there looking for a guy who's blown around by every puff of breeze? He has no spine of his own, and he's going to be swayed by every counter argument or every way of thinking. And this is the type of person he is. Is that who John the Baptist was? Was John fickle in his thinking? Was John cowardly in his action? Was John easily swayed in his opinion? Is this who John was? Absolutely not. Who was John the Baptist? And you can go back to earlier chapters in the book of Luke and find out just what type of person John the Baptist was. John was no coward. He was the type of person who had no problem calling the Pharisees a brood of vipers. He was the type of person who had no problem telling Herod the Tetrarch, one of the rulers of the area, that his marriage to his brother Philip's wife, Herodias, was wrong. And that's what it landed him in prison and later cost him his head. John the Baptist was the type of person who had no problem telling tax collectors to be honest and soldiers to not abuse their powers. John was not pushed around by the slightest wind, but held firmly to his mission from God. So that's why it's a nonsense answer. Was John easily swayed by the wind? No, he was not. So people did not go to the Jordan River, walk to the Jordan River to see somebody who would, just kind of wring in their hands and kind of dance with, I really hope that they take what I'm saying to them. No, that's not what he was. He told you the truth, and if you didn't like it, it's the truth. And he stood firm on it. So again, it's a nonsense answer. The second non-serious answer Jesus asked, what did you go out into the wilderness to see? A man dressed in fine, soft clothing? Obviously not. How is John the Baptist described? John the Baptist is described as a guy who wore a camel's hair or a camel's hide with a leather belt tied around himself, who ate locusts and wild honey. This is John the Baptist. Now, I love the fact that every time you see John the Baptist portrayed somewhere, he also has a wild beard and wild hair. Maybe the odds are in our favor, because do we honestly picture a guy who just spends all of his time out in the wilderness wearing the same thing most days? He's got to think, oh, I got to comb my hair. Well, I used to be that way. And so, nature got the best of me. But in other words, he was a guy who didn't care about the exterior. He wasn't a guy who cared about comfort. He wasn't a guy who cared about looking the part. Now, this is very important during the 3-year ministry of Jesus, because you have guys like Jesus and you have guys like John the Baptist. Now compare them to the Pharisees. John the Baptist, again, camel's hair, leather belt, locusts and wild honey. Now you have the Pharisees who loved to dress nice, Pharisees who loved to dress the part with their long tassels and their phylacteries that had to be bigger than everybody else, that put so much effort into the exteriors. And as Jesus would say in the Sermon of the Seven Woes in Matthew, on the inside, you're filled with dead man's bones. But, on the outside to look nice, yeah, like a very clean tombstone. Inside, you're dead. John the Baptist was the opposite of this. On the outside, he might not have looked that impressive. On the outside, he might not look that slick or refined. But on the inside, he was very much alive. John was working with people out in the wilderness. Again, what kind of, we need durable clothing. We need functional clothing. Suits, neckties, and whatnot, they're not my favorite types of clothes. Why? Because it's not very functional. I'm into functional clothing. I'm into the type of clothing that you can go out and to do work in and it won't fall apart on you. That's function. Just fancy clothes, that doesn't get you very much if you're trying to do really hard work. He did not take a state of dress seriously because he was trying to work hard, not just look apart. He did not play the political games in king's courts, palaces, and temples. When you get to the crucifixion of Jesus and you see the Pharisees trying to butter Pilate up, for example, so that they could have permission to crucify Jesus. In our heart of hearts, do we picture John there playing those types of games? John willing to go against his own thoughts or beliefs just so that he could have somebody executed? Someone playing the political game, word games? No. John, again, straightforward in speech, common in appearance, and intense in mission. This was John the Baptist. Jesus then launches into prophecy, biblical prophecy, to describe what John the Baptist was. And in fact, giving the true answer. What then, this is verse 26, what then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet, this is he whom it is written, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. This is out of Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. So what is he? He's a prophet. And Jesus says, yes, he is a prophet, and also more than a prophet, because according to Jesus, John the Baptist had four things going for him. He was a messenger or a prophet. Yes, he was a prophet. He was someone who did receive messages from the Lord to give to the people. Yes, and it was messages that had to do with the coming of the kingdom of heaven and the coming of the Messiah. But he also had something going for him, because there's been lots of prophets back in the Old Testament who foretold the coming of the Messiah and the coming of the kingdom of heaven. But what made John the Baptist better? What made John the Baptist better was that not only was he the messenger, but he was also the forerunner. In other words, John is the last pre-Messiah prophet. He is the last one. His messengers were geared towards the imminent coming of the Messiah. Again, prophets prophesied the coming of the Messiah. The first prophecy concerning the Messiah is all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. That's where it starts. And then going down through the lines, you start having more and more prophecies of the Messiah. But it was always, it was a far-flung thing. It's going to happen eventually. When are these things going to happen? I don't know. Or as God would tell Daniel, for example, these scary things that I'm writing to you about, you don't have to worry about it. Just go ahead and live your life. You're going to die before these things happen. Just, lock them away for now. You're fine. But John was the last one. First prophet after 430 or 400 years. First prophet. And what he's talking about is that the Messiah is coming soon. It's not distant. It's not going to be far flung. It is coming soon. One is coming after me one whom sandals I am unfit to untie. It's happening soon. So this is something else. John's the last one to foretell the coming of the Messiah. And so, but also Jesus is going to go on to say that John's the greatest born of women. He is the only prophet who got to interact with Jesus. Again, the other prophets that we've been talking about, they never got to see the Lord. Now this made them great examples of faith. The Hebrew writer will talk about Father Abraham, for example, and talk about him looking forward to his city that he will not see. Talking about all those patriarchs. They were looking forward to a city that was not their own. They were looking forward to a family that was not their own. They were looking forward to things that they were told would happen one day that they never got to experience, and they believed that it would happen. And this made them great examples of faith. But again, John, being different from the other, is a prophet who actually got to interact with Jesus, was there to baptize Jesus. And so that's how come he could be viewed as the greatest born of women, was that he was a prophet who got to see the Son of God face to face. But then Jesus twists it, and then he says, John the Baptist was the greatest born of women, but he's also the least in the kingdom of God. And we think, well, goodness sakes, how does that work? Well, that's because John the Baptist would die before Jesus could establish the kingdom of God at his death, burial, and resurrection. Again, what was John the Baptist working towards? He was working towards the coming of the Messiah, as the Gospel of John tells us. John the Baptist would say, he being Jesus, must increase and I must decrease. John's mission was to foretell the coming of the Messiah. Once Jesus started his work, John the Baptist was supposed to back off. That was his role, and he was okay with that. Now, what did Jesus work towards? Jesus worked towards the establishment of the kingdom of heaven. And so, but that didn't happen until Jesus' death. Well, but by the time Jesus dies, John the Baptist is already dead. So that's how come the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, or we might say the greatest in the church, the greatest starting with the day of Pentecost, moving forward when the church was established, 3,000 baptized in a day, and all that happened. Those who belong to the church are greater from a point of view than John the Baptist, because they get to experience what Jesus came to do, establish the kingdom of heaven. John, as great as he was, he missed that because he died early. But that's how come that he's the least in the kingdom of God. So again, Jesus does some very, very interesting teaching here. And as happens with teaching, there's reactions to it. There's two types of reactions. That's 29 and 30. It says, when all the people heard this, and the tax collectors too, they declared God just, having been baptized with the baptism of John. But the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected the purpose of God for themselves, not having been baptized by him. So you had people who liked this message, and then you had people who didn't like this message. Now, who liked this message? Well, the tax collectors, sinners, common folk. They had a wonderful reaction. They called God just. Isn't that interesting? The ones whom the Pharisees and lawyers that we're about to talk about are the ones who are considering God just. Isn't that interesting? It's not the ones who say they're on the side of God that say that God is just. It's those who we might say are the dregs of society. They're the ones who are calling God just. And it's probably one reason could be that they realize that John and also Jesus, they're working with representatives of God who care for all people and was willing to work with anyone. Again, where is Jesus now? He's out, and he's out among the people. Where is John the Baptist? John the Baptist was at the Jordan River. He wasn't at the temple. He wasn't at the synagogue. He was out, and he was out willing to work with the people. The people had to come to him. The people had to show that they cared to hear what he had to say, but he was still out, and he was willing to work with anybody who came to him. Same thing with Jesus. Jesus was out, willing to work with anybody who came to him. Who did the Pharisees work with? I'll wait. Who did the Pharisees work with? Who did the Pharisees care about? A lot of them. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Well, it's because they weren't, if you couldn't elevate their reputation, if you couldn't make them look good, they didn't waste a lot of time on you. The only reason they might pay attention to you is if you were doing something wrong. Now here was John the Baptist, and now here's Jesus, who's willing to work with the downtrodden, give hope to the hopeless, turn the hopeless into the hopeful, and bring joy and hope to those who are still captives. He is telling them wonderful things, and they love him for it. But then there's the Pharisees and the lawyers. They give this a thumbs down. They view it as a horrible message, and they give it a horrible reaction. They rejected John's message. Now remember John the Baptist now. There was Pharisees from Jerusalem that got sent out to investigate John the Baptist. Now, why was John the Baptist investigated? Well, they wanted to know what he was teaching because they viewed themselves as the religious sheepdogs of Jerusalem. If you're speaking on behalf of God, they want to know what you're saying, to know if you are teaching right or teaching in error. So that's what they did to John. And John calls them, again, brood of vipers, who warned you about the coming wrath and all this stuff. Because of their attitude, because of their unwillingness to listen to God, they didn't want much to do with John's message. John tried to warn them. The axe is at the root of the tree. You know, some chopping's about to happen. They refused John's message. They refused John's baptism. Later, they'll refuse Jesus' message as well. So the message of God is the message of God. That's one of the big themes about this section. The message of God is the message of God. John the Baptist worked with the message of God. Jesus worked with the message of God. I'm sure that their teaching styles were a little bit different, but it's still the message of God. Every Bible honest preacher out there in the world today, we might all preach a little differently. We might all have our different methods, examples, and techniques, but it's supposed to be the same message of God. The message of God is the message of God. What makes it wonderful or horrible is how we react to it. If I hear the message of God and I don't want anything to do with it, I'm not going to think the message of God has any value. Contrary-wise, if I am searching for something and I stumble upon the message of God and it resonates with me, I am going to think that it's the greatest thing since sliced bread because I have a hole inside me and I'm trying to fill it with something, and this rings of truth. And so I'm going to think it's great. It's all about how we react to it. Does it resonate? If we need it, we're going to want it. But if we don't want anything to do with it, we're going to think it's horrible. It doesn't matter. I might be harping on this point a little bit, but it's because I can't see you, so I don't know if this point is being made clear. It doesn't matter how good a preacher is. What matters is how willing are people willing to listen. And this is one of the reasons why you can be a member of a church all your life. Does not mean you're getting any gospel on the inside. How receptive are we to God's message? Okay. So again, some people liked it, others people didn't like it. Again, based on their ability to hear it. That's how come, going back to a parable class that we did last summer, I think it was, that was the name of that class because it was a statement that Jesus made. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Everybody heard Jesus' parable who was present, but not everybody got the meaning. Why? Because not everybody was listening. If you want to get the teachings of Christ, we got to be willing to hear. Okay. So then Jesus does something he's very good at, and that is turn the attention or turn the focus away from what people are talking about and turning it back to the people themselves. In this case, people are curious about John the Baptist. People are curious about Jesus. What is Jesus? Is he a prophet or is he a Messiah? And all this other stuff. And Jesus says, hold it. Stop talking about us. Let's talk about you. And so he turns it onto the crowd. Look at verse 31. It says, to what then shall I compare the people of this generation, and what are they like? They are like children sitting in the marketplace, calling to one another, we played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not weep. For John the Baptist has come eating no bread and drinking no wine, and you say he has a demon. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is justified by all her children. Jesus turns the attention back onto the people. You know, it is easy to critique preachers, prophets, Jesus and God themselves. It takes no talent to criticize. It is easy to call a sermon or a teaching good or bad. You know, I can go up there and preach a sermon, and people will tell me afterwards, you know, that was pretty good, and slap me on the back and say, you know, good job. And okay, great. But that's not why I do this. I don't do this to get your approval. Do you know that? That's not what this is about. It is not about for me to stand up there for a half an hour or so and do a little song and dance just so that I can get the approval of men. That's not what this was ever supposed to be about. But unfortunately, some people back in the day and church members today think that is exactly what it's about. It's about being able to just get our ego stroked, or to just, you know, get a little bit of Bible and say, you know what, that was good. That was good. Like you liking it meant it was good or not. It doesn't. And Luke chapter 7 is an illustration about it. Again, who liked the teachings of Jesus and who didn't like the teachings of Jesus? And did either of those opinions actually mean what Jesus said was wrong? No, none of it was about Jesus being right or wrong. It's about their willingness to listen. We think that a sermon or a teaching is good or bad based on our ability to please the ear. However, being a follower of God includes the challenge of examining the self to see where I fall short. Here, Jesus examines the crowd, and he gives them this very interesting little parable. He says, you know, what's this generation like? I'll tell you what this generation is like. You want to know what this generation is like? This generation is like a bunch of little kids in the marketplace that has some toy instruments and they're playing some music. And they'll say, hey, we played the flute for you and you're not dancing. Hey, we played the dirge for you and you're not weeping. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. Okay, so let's go back. He says, hey, we played the flute. What does that mean? The flute was associated with happy, lively music. You know, it was music that would inspire you to dance. It was something that was filled with joy. And the people say, no, I'm not feeling that today. Okay, so you're sad. Okay, we turn it around. Instead of playing happy music, since you're sad, we'll play a dirge. In other words, we'll play funeral music. We'll play the funeral march. But you don't weep. In other words, what do you want? I don't know what you want. Do you know what you want? Jesus expounds on this. John, again, his diet was locust and wild honey. John the Baptist, if you're going to put a term on John the Baptist, you might say John the Baptist was an ascetic. He drank water, he ate locust and wild honey. The Jewish leadership saw this, and they saw what kind of man John the Baptist was, and they heard what he taught, and they saw how he lived, and they said, well, obviously this guy is demon-possessed. Look at the way he is living. Okay, Jesus comes along, and in some, again, the message of John the Baptist and Jesus was the same, but the lifestyle of Jesus and John the Baptist was opposite in some ways. John the Baptist did not eat typical food, and he didn't drink wine. Jesus, on the other hand, ate what we might call everyday food, and he did drink wine. The Jewish leadership see Jesus. And in these ways, Jesus is opposite from John the Baptist. Do we think that that would make them happy? We might think so, but it didn't make them happy. Instead, the Jewish leadership considered him a glutton, a drunkard, and a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So they hear John the Baptist. They don't like what John the Baptist is about, so they say, well, forget him. We don't like him. Jesus comes along, and again, some of it's the same, but some of it is really different from John the Baptist. And they say, well, we don't like him either. Do we see the problem? They don't know what they want. We might say John was too conservative. Jesus was too liberal. The Jewish leadership viewed both to be wrong. However, wisdom is justified by all her children. What does that mean? You don't like John? You don't like Jesus. If you're trying to be a follower of God, but you don't like John the Baptist and you don't like Jesus, where are you going to be at? What do you want? Who has been shown right? Who has been shown to be right in the end? Jesus and John the Baptist. Who do we go to for the truth? Now, if you've read the Gospels before, you might know where all the Gospels lead to. All the Gospels lead to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It leads to Jesus being on that cross. And how did Jesus get on that cross? It was a prophesied event. Of course, it was a prophesied event. But from the human element, how did Jesus get on that cross? Jesus got on that cross because of jealousy. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were jealous of Jesus. Jesus was taking their followers away from them, and they grew jealous. They were face to face with the green-eyed monster, and they did not like it. They lived it when the people came to them. People weren't going to them as much. They were going to Jesus and John the Baptist. Who were the real followers of God? The people who looked the part, would play political games and dress nice on the outside. People who would change their views based on what wind was blowing in the breeze. Again, look at the Pharisees. They're willing to tell Pilate in the Gospel of John, we recognize no king except Caesar. What a bunch of bull. But they said it so that they could get their way and get Jesus executed. They would also go to Pilate and say, nobody who calls himself a friend of Caesar would allow this man free. What a bunch of bull. But they said it so that they could get their way. Jesus would not play these little word games. John the Baptist would not play these little word games either. Do we? Who were the real followers of God? The ones who were truly obedient to the word and to the will of God. The problem here was that people in Jesus and John's day wanted to be the deciders of what God's will and message should be. They wanted to decide it. They wanted to control God's will. They wanted to be able to say what God's will was. And if it came in a package that they didn't like, they would reject it. They never stopped to think that they were the ones who needed the change to fit God's will, not vice versa. Do we see the need to submit ourselves to God? Or do we expect God to submit himself to us before we will listen? That's all I got on this section. I saw that there was a question that was mentioned earlier, but they retracted the question. Maybe I should have said that at the beginning. If you type a question out, I'll get to it at the end. We'll try to do it that way. And in fact, right now, I'm going to give you just like a couple of minutes. If there's a question that you might have or something you might wish to address or bring up, something that you want me to go back and talk about a little again, I'll give you about a minute to get that typed out if there is anything. So as always, I appreciate you joining me. I'm looking forward to getting back to Luke. I love teaching out of the Gospels. It's my favorite, they're my favorite books to teach out of are the Gospels, because I have a very strong belief that people, especially people who are new to a relationship with God, people who are new to reading their Bibles, spend time getting to know Jesus. Read those Gospels, study those Gospels, because those will give you the foundation you need. After you read the Gospels and study the Gospels, go to the book of Acts, go to the epistles, give yourself grounded into the age of the church and what God wanted from the body of Christ. Then after you spend some time there, you have a pretty good foundation. Then go back, if you wish. Not if you wish, you really should. Go back and do some Old Testament reading and work and see how that goes. So that you can come to know what life was like before the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And you can also see they call them Easter eggs these days, but and what an Easter egg is if you watch a modern movie, something like a superhero movie or something that comes from a specific universe type thing, you get these little nuggets, these little Easter eggs that coin back to other events and references that are going on. You see that in the Old Testament in reference to the New. You see what life was like before the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. You see what life was like before the age of the church came, and what the sacrificial system and law of Moses was about. So, but that's the way I view. That's the suggestion I give people who are new to Bible reading. Spend some time, get to know Jesus, and that's what we're going to do on Wednesdays for a while. There's several more chapters to go, and I'm the way that Luke wrote his book, the chapters are long, so I'm not able to do a chapter a week. So it's going to be a while, but it's going to be good. It's going to be fun. And I hope that you stick with me. I'm not seeing any questions or anything. So we are going to wrap it up here tonight. So again, God bless you. We will see you soon, and you have a great rest of the week.